Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today, as always, well, not as always, but as usual, by my good friend and Republican co-host, Jay Carson. Hey, Jay, how you doing today?
Good, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, actually. You know, I thought we'd start today with the passage of the Republican tax cut bill, which President Trump signed into law on Friday. You know, there were a few last-minute procedural hurdles for the bill to overcome, and those were due largely to the reconciliation procedure Senate Republicans chose, to use in order to completely shut Democrats out of the process.
Well, no. I don't know that that's fair. Democrats could have joined in the process had they chosen to. But
we've had that regular order debate before. But anyway, but the law is essentially the same legislation we've been talking about for the last few weeks on the show, and I don't think we need to kind of reiterate our arguments, but I think just by way of summary, it's fair to say that you and I agree with the corporate tax cuts, with you being more enthusiastic than I am about that part of it.
Yeah.
But we have a major disagreement on the individual side. As I would characterize it as you holding to Republican orthodoxy that big supply side cuts to so-called job creators will trickle down and make everyone better off. Whereas I believe that very little will trickle down, and the bill is not only going to fail to unleash the growth that administration officials are promising. Gary Cohn, the top Trump economic advisor, says we're going to see growth of 4% or more in 2018 now due to the tax bill. But I think it's actually going to increase the highest level of economic inequality since the 1890s. So,
it's the 1890s.
Since the 1890s.
That's terrible.
I know. So, do you think that about sums up our positions on that?
I think so. I am more confident in growth than you are, and it's one of the wonderful things about these kinds of discussions is we will find out, right? I mean, we will see how this tracks, and there's going to be some arguments, obviously, about if there is a big economic resurgence. I would anticipate folks saying this is really just a delayed effect of the Obama stimulus from 2008 or 2009. But I think the more realistic reading would be that it's related to the tax law. And I would say this is, you mentioned the trickle down. Some companies have already started trickling down money to employees in the form of bonuses. And wage increases, notably, I think Comcast and AT&T, who are also these of course would be the folks who would be cheering the repeal of net neutrality. So I mean you have to say that's some 300,000 workers I think are getting significant $1,000 bonuses now. And again, Nancy Pelosi has sort of sneered at that, but $1,000 is $1,000.
Sure. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I hope I'm wrong about my predictions that it's not going to affect growth much, though, I'm not the only one saying that, obviously. The Federal Reserve doesn't think it's going to do nearly as much as the administration does. Goldman Sachs doesn't think it's going to do nearly as much as the administration does. But, we're all better off, I think, other things being equal, with more growth, though, again, that to the extent to which that's going to, I'll put it in a more palatable way for conservatives, the extent to which a rising tide is going to lift all boats, or if just going to bring up a lot of rich people on that swell, we'll see. But of course, I think it's ridiculous to hope that this fails. I mean, because we would all want increased growth and growth that benefits everyone. So I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm going to be.
That's very patriotic of you.
I'm a pretty patriotic guy, I'd like to think.
I would add the other thing that I think people are going to take a look at is the press on this tax cut, tax reform has tended towards the hyperbolic, and I think they're going to be burned by that. Simply because the polls show as well it's unpopular because most people think they aren't getting a tax cut. when in fact, I think 80% of all Americans are going to receive a tax cut, and those 20% who aren't are folks who are going to be in the upper tier. Um, so I mean, I think that's going to be sort of become self-evident once people start getting their checks in February and the withholding is different. And it'll certainly be apparent further down the road. Now, the question is, will the Republicans be able to take advantage of credit for this? And we'll see. But
I have a couple things I wanted to bring up about this that we haven't talked about at least that much. This is going to be a rough time for the IRS because, of course, they're the ones who have to work with this new code, and there's going to be new withholding and all kinds of other stuff that they have to do. Basically, a major tax reform requires that the IRS does even more. And back in 1986, after the last major tax reform, Congress actually significantly boosted IRS funding so that they could handle this increased workload. And, the Kevin Brady, who's the House Ways and Means Committee chair, he says he plans to sit down with the IRS commissioner and talk about implementation, though from the tone of his remarks and from what I took from those, it sounds like he thinks this should be done without any additional appropriations. And I think that's a big problem, especially given the fact that since 2010, the IRS's budget has been cut by $900 million at 17%. Their staff has been reduced by 23%. So they're being asked to do an awful lot more with an awful lot less. And I think that's a big mistake if you want this actually to work.
I'm starting to anticipate the left's line for when the IRS sort of slow walks the changes to the withholding. I consider this though. I think with the new tax proposal that's out there, you're going to see a lot fewer people itemizing, which really simplifies the job for taxpayers and the IRS.
Well, that's interesting because, of course,
I think it is going to be. It may not be the postcard that Paul Ryan promised, but I think it might be just sort of a one pager back and front as opposed to Schedule A and all the various attachments that go with that.
Well, for some people, certainly. But I mean, this is not, I think it's fair to say that in early November, when Republicans announced this, they oversold the simplification part of it. This did not really drain the swamp to any significant degree. One thing President Trump said, for instance, when this was announced, or the outline was announced in early November, he said the only people that aren't going to like this, the only business is going to be H&R Block. Well, since that date, H&R Block stock is up 14%. So I don't know. I think the markets know if you believe in that. So
no, I do believe in that, and we can talk to them. That is sort of a I don't know. That's a topic for another day. I think what H&R Block does is again something that's, I think maybe people will do that the first year and then realize, oh wait, there isn't this is easier than it used to be. I guess my comment on the I think maybe the measure of how much you're draining the swamp is sometimes how angry are the alligators. And I think the alligators have shown themselves to be pretty angry, and I think that maybe is a sign of that this is going to do some significant good in swamp drainage.
Well, I think you're wrong, but I hope you're right. One other thing I wanted to mention about the IRS, a lot of people don't realize this, but like a lot of parts of the federal government, actually, the technology that the IRS uses, much of it is incredibly antiquated. They actually, for a lot of their systems, they're based on a programming language that was developed in the late 1950s. And, these kind of overhauls of that to kind of bring these things up into, 1990s technology even, these things require a lot of time and money. And this, to me, and I've made this argument before, we talk about big and small government, and this is something I mentioned in my blog this week. What we, I think, should focus on is making smart investments to make government more efficient and more effective. And I think this is one of these things that would make a lot of sense to do, but it's really hard to sell as a PR type of thing, I think.
I think you could sell it if I'm a Republican, and I am a Republican. I would sell it as let's invest in more computers and upgrade technology for the IRS, and we're going to end up cutting IRS staff. I think that would be a good Republican argument to have, and I have no issue in principle with that sort of expenditure. Um, and I think also if you look at the bigger term, the type of money you would be talking about is spending for the IRS to do these upgrades, again, is insignificant compared to everything that is going to come out of the tax reform piece.
Well,
So
sure, I would agree with you, but I think a lot of conservatives who might actually respond to that argument would be worried that they get a challenge from the right, from someone saying, "Look, they
sure, you
approved
want to
$1 billion
increase. Right.
more for the IRS," and that's rough to do. One final thing before I move on, I should point out that President Trump still claims that this tax bill is going to hurt him, though of course without the release of his income taxes, we can't tell either way. And I'd sure like to see legislation come out that requires that both major party nominees release their returns for the last decade, though I don't know that that's going to happen anytime soon, though I think that would be a positive thing.
Nah.
Yeah, okay, fair
I
enough.
mean, I just, again, I would say I don't see the need for legislation on that.
I
Either
wouldn't have either before Trump.
they do or they don't, and the political consequences flow from that. If people are really concerned and really want to see someone's tax returns or won't vote for them without seeing their tax returns, well, there's your answer.
Yeah, well, I understand the argument. I
And
disagree,
look,
but
I would agree. I mean, to me personally, if I were Trump, I think he should have produced his tax returns, but he didn't, and he still won. So
he did. Definitely he did. All right, let's move on. This week, the United Nations responded to President Trump's recent recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The General Assembly voted overwhelmingly in favor of a resolution supporting the long-time international consensus on the status of Jerusalem, and that is that it's a matter that can only be settled as part of an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. Only 9 countries voted against the resolution, the U.S. and Israel, of course, along with, let me get the list, this impressive list, Togo, Micronesia, Nauru?
Nauru,
Nauru?
yes,
Palia, help me out here, Jay.
Paulo, I think.
Palau, thank you. Marshall Islands, Guatemala, and Honduras. Now, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, said that the United States would be taking names and that a vote against the United States was a show of disrespect. And of course, President Trump followed up by suggesting that countries not voting with the U.S. might well see their foreign aid slashed in retaliation. So, Jay, what did you make of all this?
Well, I don't think it's any surprise, right? Do you? I mean, this is in large part what the UN does. It sort of exists almost to condemn Israel. They've so I think of the UN Human Rights Commission. There was there was something of 50% of all their resolutions within the last 10 years. It was 5 years, 10 years. We're for the purpose of condemning Israel. And you look at some of the unsavory characters who are on that committee. Look, this is sort of part and parcel for what the UN has done for 40 some years, condemning Israel, going back to the idea of Zionism as racism and so forth. So to me, it's no big surprise, no big deal. I think Nikki Haley has done a really pretty good job as UN ambassador, and I think calling out these other countries, I think it's a good thing. Now, whether we actually are going to cut foreign aid to these places, I doubt, because I think there are plenty of other concrete strategic considerations that go into that. Beyond what is, at this point, pretty much a symbolic vote. But it's good to, I think, flex our muscles and to recall that also the United States funds more than a quarter of all of the UN's budget, and that's awfully generous of the U.S. considering how it's often treated at the UN. So,
well, to me, it reminds me a little bit of sort of how I feel about the Paris climate agreement, that when almost the entire world seems to be lined up against you. I'm not saying that you should just follow along with the rest of the world, but it should at least give one pause to say, well, almost this is the extent of the coalition we can get. A few islands in the Pacific, essentially, and a few Central American countries. Maybe that's a message. Maybe at least we should be slightly reflective about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I don't think I see that. And secondly, she said this idea that Nikki Haley, maybe she misspoke, I don't know, but she flat out said essentially that voting against us is a sign of disrespect. I think that just sounds ridiculous. That sounds like, threatening and bullying. And you can certainly respect the country and not follow right along with them. I don't think that we've suddenly disrespected, say, I don't know, Canada or the UK, both of whom, voted against us on this, I believe. So, I mean, would you agree with that?
I think that is just sort of disrespect. And I get the idea of Nikki Haley saying that making a statement saying it's disrespecting us to vote against us is bullying. I mean, consider that what happened is the United States, which is its own sovereign nation, decided to place its embassy in Jerusalem. Well, it hasn't actually happened, but it would view Jerusalem as the capital, which is how the Israeli independent sovereign state views it, as well as I think you mentioned the Russians, which is kind of funny. But we made that decision, and then the world rises up to condemn that decision. So look, who's being the bullies here? And I don't buy this, and I've said this before. The same with Paris, that the measure of leadership is we go along with everybody else.
Sure.
So,
no, and I agree with you on that, but I guess my larger point is, are you saying that it's impossible to vote against the United States and still respect the United States?
Oh no,
Okay,
but
I
I
just
think
wanted
you
to be
can
clear
say,
on that.
no, but I think you can say that a particular vote is an act of disrespect or is disrespectful.
Okay, so in
If
other
if you
words,
follow me, it's
yeah,
not. I'm not saying that hey Britain, it's over.
right, sure.
No, this is a
But but
matter of
but but
we think that action was disrespectful.
but on this issue, you're saying that another country can't simply disagree with, or simply can't simply say, we still hold that the status of Jerusalem should be determined as part of a final agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that acknowledging that or that approving that is somehow disrespectful automatically to the United
Yeah,
States.
well, again, the resolution though wasn't to say, hey, we think that the status of Jerusalem should be up for grabs in some peace settlement down the road. The resolution was to condemn the United States of America. I think that is disrespectful. I mean, and if you want to take the position that no, we disagree with this, and it ought to be settled in a broader peace agreement, fine, then you can do what the 35 countries who abstained did, and say, look, we're going to abstain from that vote.
Right. Okay, I
But
should point out.
I think let's put it this way: if you're going to condemn someone, again, that's a little stronger than we disagree with you.
Okay, fair enough. And I should point out that actually that one of those countries abstaining was in fact Canada. I think earlier I said that they voted against it, and they didn't. The UK did, though, vote against it. All right, moving
Canada's
on.
still cool.
What's that?
Canada's still cool.
There you go. Okay, now before we get to our next story, we'd like to thank our newest supporters. Thanks first to Jared and Murdoch. They are our latest monthly sustaining supporters through Patreon. Thank you both very much. Thanks also to Bond from Papillion, Nebraska, who made an extremely generous donation to the show through PayPal. And Bond writes, I've been a listener since the early days. Keep up the good work. And
Thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. And of course, with our move to an ad-free format in February of 2018, your support more important than ever. And if you'd like to join Jared, Murdoch, Bond, and all our other great supporters, just go to politicsguys.com and click on either the Patreon or PayPal links. Okay, go ahead, Jim.
Can I throw in one more thing about the UN?
You sure can.
Well, yeah, and this is something else to consider, is that the following day after the condemnation, the UN General Assembly very broadly voted to condemn or to impose sanctions on North Korea, which was an effort obviously led by the U.S. So I mean, I think that sometimes we need to separate what the UN does, which is often simply symbolic, which I think, the when you're condemning someone else's actions, that is purely symbolic, as opposed to things that actually might have some real teeth, like increased sanctions. And I think that's one of those, it sort of shows, look, this is sometimes it's just a dance. It is just sort of make believe when push comes to shove. I don't think, the U.S. did not lose any leadership credibility, I guess, as evidenced by that vote the next day on North Korea.
Okay, fair enough. I don't know if I entirely agree with the not losing any credibility, but I take your point. So, and we can kind of stick with national security stuff, I think, because of course this week President Trump presented his first national security strategy, and that's something that's been required of all presidents by Congress since back in the 1980s. And normally, this is really an almost unnoticed pro forma type of thing, but President Trump, for whatever reason, I don't know, chose to highlight it by announcing the release of the document himself. And the strategy calls for an America First approach, very Trumpian, and returns to I would call it a more confrontational style than what we saw in the Obama administration. It also downplays climate change.
Maybe more assertive.
Okay.
Assertive.
We can. That's a different word, but okay. It also downplays climate change as a national security threat, despite the Pentagon's conclusion that climate change remains one of the greatest threats to U.S. security. And strangely, at least I think it's strange, it also calls for upgrading diplomatic capabilities, even though President Trump and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson have presided over what some call a gutting of capabilities at the State Department. I mean, you take a look at President Trump's budget request. He called for the State Department budget to be cut by nearly a third. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Finally, the strategy calls for something called principled realism. It's one of those buzz phrases, I guess, which apparently entails acknowledging the role of power in international relations. That would be the realism part. But at the same time, attempting to advance American values throughout the world. And again, I'd argue that that's something that President Trump doesn't necessarily always seem interested in doing, at least that is if you consider human rights to be an American value, which I do. Go ahead, Jay.
No, I think principled realism, I would say I like that, actually. And you have to, I can't imagine that Trump came up with that himself.
Oh, no.
Because that sounds very political science-y. And sort of this is here a new doctrine and so forth. So I actually, to me, that makes a lot of sense because I interpret that as doing what you can where you can. Do what good you can where you can. For example, again, to challenge the human rights abuses that go on in China is more difficult because of China's size, their economy, the relationship with us. We can only have so much influence. For us to influence human rights in other countries where we have a stronger influence is something different. So I think, and I've often said this, it's not necessarily hypocrisy to take care of one smaller evil or one problem that's easier to take care of just because you can't take care of the bigger problem. So I think that's a good sort of view to take, principled realism. I like that. Now, and again, it's fuzzy enough that it's difficult to tell where the principle ends and the realism kicks in, but we will see that. So
yeah, well, I guess, and I've talked about this before. The one thing that bothers me is I take your point, and I think it's a good point that we can only have so much influence over the human rights, domestic, internal policies of another country. But I think there's something to be said for at least making it an issue, understanding, and I think this would fit in with what I would see as a principled realism is making it an issue, bringing it up, and understanding that we probably aren't going to get a lot of movement on it, but not taking it off the table. And I think that's what President Trump has done too much of. Now, I understand some on the right would argue that President Obama went too far the other way. And I guess you could almost say in part, and we see this time and time again, is that presidents, especially in foreign policy, often sort of counter react or swing the other way from the previous president. Obviously, after 8 years of President George W. Bush, our foreign policy after that became a little less aggressive, assertive, I guess you could
Assertive.
say. And then now we're seeing a swing back after 8 years of President Obama. And so that's, to a certain extent to be expected. But I do wish that President Trump would emphasize human rights at least a little bit more when he talked with some of these foreign leaders. Well, we've got some sort of good news to close out the show today. There won't be a government shutdown, at least not until late January, thanks to Congress passing a short-term extension that funds the government through January 19th. And President Trump signed the bill just before leaving for his Christmas vacation. Importantly, I think, the bill also provides stopgap funding for the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP as it's sometimes called. Nearly 2 million of the over 9 million kids covered by CHIP were actually at risk of losing their coverage in January if Congress hadn't acted to provide emergency funding. And for a while, it looked like that might actually happen, but I guess leaving millions of kids without insurance isn't anyone's idea of good politics, so a crisis was averted for now, at least. So, Jay, would you agree that that's reasonably good news, at least by our greatly diminished American politics in 2017 standards?
Well, I think so, and I think we both predicted that this is what would happen.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was any appetite for a government shutdown, and I don't think we don't seem to be at the let's say the tipping point, where that's going to happen. I don't think we'll have a government shutdown in January either. But we'll see. But I'm willing to put my marker out right now that I think we will get if nothing else, again, continuing resolution and probably some work on the shoring up the Obamacare exchanges and on Dreamers, perhaps.
Yeah. I think we'll see action on all of those things, and I hope there'll be at least some sort of bipartisan. Well, that's asking too much. Never mind. I'm getting a little crazy here with the Christmas spirit and the optimism and all that kind of thing. So we'll just leave it at that. But anyway, that is at least somewhat good news. So let's move on to what we're reading, where we step back from the normal news cycle and talk about more in-depth, thoughtful things we're reading or listening to or watching. Now, before we do that, Jay, I understand. You don't have what you're reading this week, but there's one more issue that just kind of bugged you that you'd like to talk about.
I think I can probably do it as a what I'm reading. I would
Okay.
say Yuval Levin has a piece in National Review. You can get on National Review online. No, HHS did not ban words. And that just sort of goes with what has sort of been sticking in my craw for the last week. The harkening back to, there was the George Carlin bit of the 7 dirty words. There was a Washington Post story that reported, this is verbatim from the Washington Post, the Trump administration is prohibiting officials at the nation's top public health agency from using a list of 7 words or phrases, including fetus and transgender, in official documents being prepared for next year's budget. Now, then this of course blew up onto the internet of zillions of memes that flooded my inbox, and worrisome concerns of this is Orwellian and censorship, and what about people who need to communicate disease-related information and within the CDC, and they can't do that. The terms, and I'll see if I have all 7 in front of me. Also included vulnerable, diversity, entitlement, as well as transgender, fetus, and what am I missing? Oh, science-based and evidence-based. So there was this big to-do, and then, of course, what troubled me was if you read the Washington Post article, the original reporting, and Mike, this is something you and I argue about. This is a grammar stylistic thing. The excessive use of passive voice. This is going back 20 some years. But the story is written in many ways in the passive voice, and to me, as someone who reads a lot and writes a lot, there was, for example, there was also a discussion that, see, I just did it. which a prohibition had been conveyed verbally in a meeting among career officials. Uh, when you use it, when someone is using the passive voice, it is always reason for suspicion, because what they're trying to do is hide the actor of who actually did what, and typically obscure what happened. And as this story was reported in greater detail, and again, I would point you to the Yuval 11 piece. Um, what this actually was a meeting about uh, putting together your budget requests for the next biennium, next fiscal year, and there was a stylistic guide that the CDC had prepared. Now, this had been prepared not by Obama or not by Trump or political appointees, but by career CDC officials. And they had proposed not using words like entitlement and vulnerable and poor, I think was another one.
Because Republicans hate those words.
And diversity. Well, yes. I mean, I think to some extent, yes, Republicans do hate those words, but also, I mean, to me, when I'm reading something and this is give me money, and you start in with the diversity and poor and vulnerable. They're words that often don't mean much. They're sort of fluff. If you are a budget hawk reading to say, what does this actually do? Why should I actually support it? Words like that shouldn't be included. I think that's just a strategic thing in writing these kind of proposals. But so to me, the bigger piece is, and then in this meeting, which as Levin reports, there were no political appointees. It was all career CDC folks. They had other people chime in of other words that might not be used, and that included transgender and so forth. So what troubles me is this was blown up into a Trump bans language, when what in fact happened was career bureaucrats suggested not to use certain words in budget documents because they were afraid that it might strike Republicans the wrong way. And it just if you read the Washington Post story and compare to what really happened, and this is again the first time I heard the Post story, because I've got some experience in this kind of thing, and I've been in these kind of meetings. It struck me immediately what happened, what was going on. But the idea that Trump is banning words, it was a complete fiction, and yet the internet erupted with it. And that's what troubles me. And if you are a Trump hater or a Trump skeptic like me, consider that whenever the mainstream media does these kind of things, Trump wins, because eventually the story comes out and like, oh, well, he didn't really ban all that. Oh, and look, my estimation of the Washington Post, which was not tremendous to begin with, has increased a little bit, because look, these are people who cover these issues all the time. They knew what was going on. They could have reported this in a direct but not disingenuous way, but they chose otherwise.
No, I disagree. I disagree. I agree with you on this. I think it was bad reporting, sloppy reporting by the Washington Post, which usually does a most excellent job. But again, I see it as more an indictment of media in general with, oh, you get this juicy scoop sort of thing and you run with it before you actually bother to check, and like you said, use the passive voice to cover up perhaps some issues that there might be with it. And I think this was definitely a case of bad reporting, a story that shouldn't have gotten out, but it was just too juicy for today's media to pass up.
The words that are often used in the more conservative world is too good to check. And that's this kind of story. And you and I have talked about this, I don't know, numbers of times. If you read a story that says, and it hits you right away, you're like, oh, it's just like what those SOBs would do. Reconsider, because if it appeals to your prejudices so immediately like that, then I think oftentimes it's not accurate.
I think, and it's something we see on, this is definitely, I'd say, a bipartisan thing. It's a common occurrence on Fox News, the preferred outlet for much of the right, and we certainly sometimes see it too in the Washington Post, New York Times, and other outlets on the left. So absolutely. All right. Well, I have a what we're reading thing. It's a book that I just recently finished called American Amnesia by political scientists Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson. It's Hacker and Pearson have been doing, I think, great work about economic policy for, a number of years now. It's a little less political sciencey than their previous book, Winner Take All Politics, which I really enjoyed a lot, and in fact, use in a number of my classes. I would definitely recommend it to anyone who wants sort of a big picture view of how sort of public policy, particularly economic policy, has changed since the 1950s. And I really like these kind of big picture, multi-generational type of things. Now, it definitely is a left-wing type of perspective, and they're a little further left than I am, but I think they have some valuable insights about how the Republican Party became what it is and how the Democrats too became what they are from where we started, say, in the 1950s. So I would definitely recommend that to folks.
All right.
Right. And also, I should mention, if you want something a little shorter, my latest blog post was about government capabilities, and I write a little bit about what I think is the false dichotomy between big government and small government. And we talked about that a little bit earlier when we were talking about the IRS thing and so forth. And I think to me that's an example of there are instances where I think we can get some bipartisan agreement that it makes more sense to invest in government in certain ways. Certainly, that it will increase the size of government, but it might actually lead to better outcomes for both conservatives and liberals. So anyway,
you would prefer a small but brutal IRS.
Effective, let's say that. Okay, I'll use that word. All right. Well, before we close today, we'd like to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, a happy holiday season, a fantastic New Year, whatever you're celebrating during this period between late December and early January. We hope it's a great one. And we'd also like to thank all of you for listening this year and helping us to grow 15 times the size we were at the beginning of 2017. That's a 1,389% increase. Wow.
That's significantly more than what the Congressional Budget Office predicted we'd grow at.
There you go. And it's all thanks to you all who are listening. We really appreciate it. Also, we're incredibly grateful for our wonderful financial supporters who've donated through Patreon and PayPal and who help make this show possible. So everyone, it's been a great 2017. We've really enjoyed it. And thank you so much. And we're going to actually be taking the next week off for our holiday break. But we will be back with a Wednesday show on, I believe it's Wednesday, January 3rd. And then we'll be back with the Saturday show, 3 days after that? So I guess that would be January 6th, wouldn't it, Jay?
That sounds about right.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Again, listener support. If you want to help us out, go to politicsguys.com, click on either that PayPal or Patreon link. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can share the episode with your friends and followers, pass along new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter, and leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also does help. And if you want to get in touch with us, we're at mail@politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/politicsguys page. We post stuff all the time there, and we're also on Twitter at politicsguys.
Is it too late? Is it too late to order Politics Guys coffee mugs for Christmas?
Well, they probably won't get there in time for Christmas, but they'd make a fine, I don't know, President's Day gift or something.
Right.
I guess
or Eastern Orthodox, perhaps.
That's right. There you go. And we actually have a link on the website there. So. Good point. We should have really thought about that about a month ago. Oh well. Anyway, we're so good at the merchandise stuff. Anyway, the executive producers of the Politics Guys are me, Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski with an assist by the crazy barking dogs in the background that you might have heard. We had package delivery and my one dog just went totally insane. Sorry about that. Anyway, we'll be back from our holiday break with a new show on Wednesday, January 3rd. We hope you'll join us.